Respected guests, esteemed faculty, dear students, and cherished members of Voices from the Periphery. It is not every day that we welcome a thinker whose very name has become synonymous with the craft of oral history. Today, with pride and reverence, we gather to honor Professor Alessandro Portelli, a scholar whose work has not only chronicled the voices of the margins but has taught us to listen differently, to hear history not as an archive of facts alone but as a living chorus of memory, meaning, and resistance. Professor Portelli stands among the most celebrated interpreters of oral tradition and subaltern experiences in our time. As professor of American literature at the Sapienza University of Rome, he has shaped generations of scholars, but his influence reaches far beyond the classroom. Through his pathbreaking works, he has given us a new language for thinking about history, not as something fixed in the stone, but as something continually reshaped in the telling, in the silences, and in the emotions that narratives carry. His books have become classics. The death of Luigi, Trastulli, and other stories showed us how memory itself is a political act. The Battle of Valle Giulia illuminated how protest, youth, and cultural imagination interest. They say in Harlan Country brought the voices of Appalachian coal miners into dialogue with global struggles of labor and dignity. In every war, he has insisted that the periphery is not marginal to history, but central to understanding its deepest roots. What makes Portelli unique is not only his scholarship but his humanity. His interviews are not transactions, they are encounters. He listens not to extract but to co-create meaning with those whose stories he records. For him, the migrant worker, the protester, the singer of folk ballads are not mere informants. They are historians in their own right, keepers of knowledge and shapers of memory. This radical respect has made his work foundational for oral historians, cultural critics, and all who believe that history belongs to the people. His honors are many. His contributions vast, but his legacy is simple and profound. He has taught us that listening is an ethical practice and that to listen deeply to the periphery is to discover the very heart of democracy. It is in the spirit that we await his lecture today, Periphery and Migration in Rome, in a city so often imagined through its monuments and empires. Professor Portelli will take us twisted to its outskirts, to the voices of migrants, workers, and those who live in the shadow of grandeur. He will remind us that Rome, like all cities, is not only the story of power, but also of those who build, sustain, and transform it. On behalf of Voices from the Periphery, I extend our warmest welcome and deepest gratitude to Professor Alessandro Portelli. To listen to him is to rediscover what history can be: alive, contested, intimate, and transformative. We are privileged to have him with us today, and we know that his words will not only inform us but will resonate like the songs and stories he so carefully preserves in the chambers of our collective memory. Thank you, sir. Up to you.
Well, thank you. Thank you for this very flattering introduction, and thank you for the opportunity of um, creating a conversation, a dialogue with scholars so far from where I am, but so close in terms of cultural and political passions and interests. Um, you mentioned my work in Appalachia in the United States. Well, I remember that my first article on my Appalachian work, which was based on the oral histories of coal miners and other migrants, was called "Two Peripheries Talk to Each Other," and it was based on the fact that basically what we're working on is peripheries. Appalachia had been described by local sociologists like David Walls and others as an internal periphery of the United States. On the other hand, the Italian semiologist Umberto Eco had described Italy as a periphery of the empire, of the American empire. So that a project in which somebody like me from the periphery of the empire came to listen and study and learn from the internal periphery of the empire, took the title of Two Peripheries Talk to Each Other. And in a way, a great deal of the work we have been doing in oral history and in post-colonial literature and studies is exactly the work of putting peripheries in touch without having to depend on the mediation of the empire, of the center. What I would like to talk to you about today, however, is only one side of this dialogue, which is my own city of Rome, where I was born and where I taught and where I live. Rome, as you very well know, is used to be the center of an empire, and it's still the center of the Catholic Church and the capital of the Italian state. So that somehow, when we think of Rome, we do not think of a periphery. We think of a center. We think of empire, unless we start looking at it from a different point of view. And I remember my initiation, the moment in which I realized that oral history changes the point of view. I had just begun a project on the history of a mass massacre conducted by the Nazis, the German occupiers in Rome in 1944, when the Nazis murdered more than 300 people, civilians, in supposedly to punish the city of Rome, to terrify the city of Rome after an attack by the underground, the partisans and the resistance. And I had just conducted an interview, my first interview in the project, with one of the partisans that were active in the struggle against the German occupation and had participated in the attack that generated the retaliation. And and I talked to him. We sat down in an outside a coffee place in the center of Rome, actually, and we talked for about an hour or so. And he told me the story of the resistance, the story of the massacre, the story of the response to the massacre. And then after the interview, as I walked to the subway to get back home. I live in the periphery, as a matter of fact, actually in the suburbs, which is different. I began to notice the signs of another history. I began to notice the graffiti on the walls that talked about contemporary issues, and the struggle of memories over the resistance, which is the 1940s, and then a plaque with the names of people that had been murdered in the massacre in 1944. And as I was walking through the center of Rome, going to the subway, a thought crossed my mind, which was, wow, I didn't realize that this town had a history. And then I said, well, what am I talking about? Rome. Rome is history. Rome is the Colosseum. Rome is St. Peter's. And the fact is that this great history, the Forum, the Empire, has somehow overwhelmed and squashed the fact that Rome also has a history of common people, of working classes, of peripheries, and that the dynamics, the dialectics between the periphery and the center shaped uh, all the modern history of Rome. In other words, looking at the city of Rome from the periphery meant looking at a modern city, not just an archaeological site or a tourist site, meant looking at a place where real people live and struggle. Um, one warning: if if you like, you can interrupt any time and ask questions or comments. Uh, this can be a dialogue, not just my monologue. Anyway, on the other hand, if you look uh, at the history of Rome as an empire, as a center of empire, you immediately realize that for uh, all for centuries, um, at the beginning of at the height of the empire, Rome was a city of immigrants. People came to Rome from all over the Mediterranean, from all over what was then the known world, the Mediterranean, the Near East, and so that, in fact, some of the emperors of Rome were born in Syria. Some were born. We had African emperors, and most of all, huge immigrant communities took place right there. Took roots right there in the center of the empire. This is the way Christianity came to Rome. Immigrants from the Middle East coming to Rome and bringing their religion, their beliefs to the city, so that the whole history, even of imperial Rome, was shaped by this influx of immigrants from the peripheries of the empire, what was then the peripheries of what was then the empire. So somehow this has remained the a central feature of the identity of the city of Rome. And especially since Rome, I will skip a couple of thousand years and go back to when Rome became the capital of the newly established United Kingdom of Italy, 1870. When the Rome became the state capital, on the one hand, of course, you had all the influx of the northern of the people that came in from the north to work in the ministry, to administer. They were mainly the elites of the government, of the army, and so on. But these people needed homes, and so there was another influx from southern Italy of people that came in from south to build the homes, the spaces, to rebuild the city in order to allow it to function as a national capital. So once again, it was from the peripheries of the state that people came as administrators, army officers, and from the north, and as construction workers, mainly from the center and the south. So, in fact, when you look one of the reasons why I decided to work on this project on the Fosse Ardeatine massacre in 1944 was that I had been thinking I should do an oral history of Rome. However, how do you do an oral history of a city that's not only 3,000 years old, but also at the time had like almost 3 million people? Somehow you need a focus, you need a point of view. And it occurred to me that that particular day, in which 335 Romans were murdered for basically murdered to punish the city for resisting the Nazi and fascist occupation, was an interesting point of view for to examine the identity of the city. So if you take the list of the people that were killed in the massacre, 1944, about 80% are immigrants. The 14 of them came from the region of Puglia, which is the deep south, 9 from the island of Sardinia, and they so that you because the people that were killed in the massacre were more or less a cross section of the population of Rome, you suddenly realize that the makeup of the population of Rome was basically 80% not native, immigrant. My own family, I'm only second generation Italian, Roman. My grandfather came from Sicily, and my wife's parents also came from the south. We're not working class, we're middle class, but this shows how Rome is truly a town of a city of immigrants. On the other hand, even the partisans who fought in the resistance were largely from migrant origin, and their leader was the grandson of a man who had been the leader of a rebellion in Sicily in the 1850s. So that suddenly you have the sense that Rome as a hub of people coming in from all over the country. This lasted basically until the early 20s. Then there was an interruption. There was an interruption because the new government, then the fascist regime, right-wing, racist, nationalist, wanted to keep people in the country as much as possible, working in agriculture, living in villages, and so they actually forbade people from migrating to the city. However, after the war, when it was still illegal, people began to come to Rome anyhow, and they were really literally illegal. If you came from because you had to have a job to have a permit, to have a residence permit in Rome, but you had to have a residence permit in Rome in order to have a job. So this mass of people were literally illegal, and they are the ones that began to expand the city, especially in the direction of the southeast, with new neighborhoods and there were mainly working class neighborhoods, but also somehow marked by regional identities. There were enclaves of people from Puglia, from the Marche, from the Abruzzi. So, and also people kept coming in to work in the construction industry. Rome has never been an industrial city itself. The main industry has always been the construction, housing, and and they were homeless themselves. So that throughout the belt around the city, you had shanty towns, favelas, slums, inhabited by uh, immigrants from mainly south and the central south of Italy. And that's the other. That was my first. That was my first oral history project. My first oral history project was aimed at reconstructing the life stories and the cultural background of these migrant people living in these abandoned peripheries of Rome. And I discovered two things. One, uh, these people were the spearhead, the vanguard of the most important social struggle in Rome, which was a struggle for housing. The So I did a number of interviews in occupied buildings where the homeless people occupied buildings that had been built by housing speculators, but had been left empty, waiting for the rents to rise, and therefore, so the homeless occupied them and fought with the police, and there was so that this homeless movement, these people, masses of people, families squatting in empty buildings or abandoned buildings throughout the city, was literally a wave of folks from the periphery of the city invading spaces in the center. And this had also been the pattern of social movements and class struggle in Rome since the end of World War II, since the 40s and 50s. The people from the working people from the peripheries, primarily the women from the peripheries, came to Rome, marched to the center of Rome, occupied spaces in the center of Rome in order to claim their rights to decent living conditions, like basic needs, running waters, toilets, jobs, transportation. So it was really from the 50s to the 70s, the movement was the center invading the peripheries invading the center. And to me, there is a very symbolic moment, in which I also learned something else. And the symbolic moment is in March 1970 actually, when a group of maybe 100 families that had occupied an apartment building in the suburbs, and we know what the difference is between the periphery and the suburbs, were expelled, were evicted, but rather than going back to their shanties, to their slums, they marched to the center, to the symbolic center, let's put it this way, symbolic center of Western civilization, Capitol Hill, which is not only the place, the seat of the city government in Rome, but also the historic place where the Roman Empire, and therefore when we think of Western civilization, began. So these people that came from the peripheries of the state, They came from the deep south, and they lived in the periphery of the city, uh, occupied the center, and they sat down, and they occupied this, which which happens to be one of the tourist spots of Rome. They occupied the symbolic space for about a week. Now, what happened was that the as they occupied the space, this was late February, early March. It was still cold, and of course they couldn't light a fire in the center of the of Capitol Hill. So what they did was to keep warm, they started dancing. They started playing music and dancing. And then, uh, and one of the things that they did was they started improvising verses that described what they were doing, and addressing the mayor and saying, "I'm not moving. I've been spending, I've stayed here 5 nights in this place, and I will not move until they give me what I want, what I came here for." It was only later that I realized that what they were doing was not something new. What they were doing was exactly what they had been doing for generations in the South. Because one of the great cultural practices in the South is the pilgrimage to the shrines of the Madonna, of Jesus, of the saints. People from the villages, from the countryside, every year, thousands of people just walk, more recently drive or bus to these shrines, and they sit outside the shrine for 4 or 5 nights a week, and they sing songs and say prayers that say exactly the same thing. I've been spending my nights here at the shrine, and I'm not leaving unless I receive what I'm praying for. So what I discovered was that the immigrants, the migrants, were adapting their traditional culture to the new conditions. They were able to occupy the capital and to express their demands precisely because they had the experience of occupying the shrines and expressing their demands to God, to Mary, rather than to the mayor. So that that was perhaps the most interesting culture, the most interesting part of the project. That is the discovery of how the main weapon for understanding their the state in which they were living, for understanding their condition and their experience, and for voicing it, was a readaptation of their traditional culture. One of the songs that they sang on Capitol Hill, the people that were occupying Capitol Hill, I later went and interviewed them where they were living. And one of the songs that they sang was an old folk song, a traditional folk song, that said, I spent my life building a castle, thought that I would live in it. As soon as it was finished, they took the keys from my hands, which is exactly what happens to those people as construction workers. They spent their lives building the homes in which people like me live, and as soon as the homes are finished, the keys are taken from their hands. They build the homes, but they can't live in them, just as the hero in the folk song built the castle but couldn't live in it. So, or a couple of ladies in one of the worst shanty towns, they sang. They were improvising love verses, traditional or improvised verses, basically about love and so on. And gradually I realized, it was songs that said, "I love you, but but you don't love me." Suddenly realized that they were no longer talking about, you know, romantic love. They were talking about their relationship to the city of Rome. We came here filled with love, and you turned us down. So that the reinterpretation of traditional culture was the main weapon of cultural resistance and also political resistance. So that was my first um, experience working with trying to learn about the relationship between the migrants, the peripheries, and the center. The when the folks from the periphery of the state, living in the periphery of the city, occupied the center, the symbolic center of the state, and used their traditional culture to voice their demands and to explain what they were doing. Now, for generations, immigration in Rome meant in, inner immigration, immigration within Italy, people from basically from the southern peripheries of the country moving to the capital and creating the peripheries of the capital. In fact, a great deal of the resistance also took place in the peripheries, even though the most dramatic episodes took place in the center, but it was in the peripheries. It was in the working class neighborhoods far from the center that the resistance was organized, that the Nazis actually could not enter certain neighborhoods in the peripheries of Rome. So that the history of Rome was being made in the peripheries, was being made in the transformation of the uh, structure of the city, uh, which was expanding and generating new, often self-built neighborhoods and barrios, um, and then the resistance was fought. The anti-fascist struggle, the anti-Nazi struggle, was fought in the peripheries. The labor movement and the struggle for housing and social justice came from the peripheries to the center. Um, Italy had been, as you probably know, also a colonial state, uh, even though we started later than other European nations. But the Italian colonial history was as criminal and as bloody as anyone's, especially it was Italy that invented the concentration camps in Libya, Italy that invented the air bombings, and the first bombs dropped from a plane were dropped by an Italian plane on a village in Libya in 1912, and Italy massacred shamelessly the resistors in Ethiopia, and also used illegal weapons, gases, and others. However, uh, we had, as opposed to other colonial powers with a longer history of imperialism, Italy hardly had any immigrant population from its former colonies, and in fact, until maybe the mid 80s, the presence of immigrants from Africa or Latin America, but basically, or the Middle East, or um, today one of the major immigrant communities is from Bangladesh, um, was almost until the 1980s. There was a trickle, but it was almost invisible, and then suddenly. The movement grew, and all of a sudden Italy, which had been historically a country of immigrants, we had at least 20 million immigrants that emigrated to North America, South America, Australia, and also other European nations between at the beginning of the 20th centuries and after the end of World War II. Suddenly, Italy became also a country of immigration. We still have a powerful outflux of people who emigrate from Italy, and not just both, workers and intellectuals leaving the country because there's little employment, or there are very limited opportunities for careers, but also hundreds, thousands of people coming in from Africa, not just the old Italian colonies, from a lot from Nigeria, Ghana, Gambia, Dahomey, Cameroon, and then from Afghanistan, Iraq, and from India, Bangladesh, the Philippines. So suddenly, again, if you think of Europe as a center of something, the whole periphery of the world, from Ecuador to Bangladesh, from Dahomey to Syria, has been coming here. And we just had incidentally, just the other day, about 70 people, including children, were drowned a few miles from the Italian coast because the current neo-fascist government of Italy refuses to help them because they're illegal. So what happened was that these people also moved into the peripheries of the city. And interestingly, what happened was that this immigration did not create ghettos, but rather complicated coexistence between the older generation, the older residents who are now second, third generation of the children and grandchildren of the original immigrants from southern and central Italy, and the newcomers from other parts of the world. And it's been a complicated coexistence because, on the one hand, the politics, the discourse of the right wing that controls basically the Italian government and a lot of the media has been: these people are taking our jobs, these people are dangerous, these people are aliens, and of course there have been racist incidents. On the other hand, somehow, especially in some of the older peripheries of the city, people realize that, the local people realize that these were people just like them, that they were basically trying to make a living, and somehow some form of uneasy coexistence came about. Now, of course, we have children who were born in Italy from immigrant parents, even third generations of kids that were born in Italy, but the Italian law does not recognize them as Italian citizens. So we have like a few 100,000 children and young people living here, paying taxes here, going to school here, working here, not being recognized as citizens. And this is one of the main struggles. Now, what fascinated me was the fact that, well, this new wave of immigration was also bringing in culture and creating culture. I had been in my job as a professor of American literature, teaching about the history of African American literature, and it occurred to me that there may be an African Italian literature, a Bangladeshi Italian literature, Brazilian Italian literature that we didn't know about. So I began in the 1990s collecting and encouraging the writings of this new wave of migrations, and in fact, which is now being recognized as the most interesting part of Italian literature, with writers like Ijabashego, born in Somalia, and who's probably one of the most interesting writers in Italy and in Italian, or Cristina Alifara, Italian writers, black Italian writers, African Italian writers who are now being translated all over the world and so on. But back in 1990, when I and a few others began to listen to them, to read them, we were, turned down by the establishment, by the university itself, that said, no, this has nothing to do with Italian literature. And then it occurred to me that something like that might be happening with music as well. Somehow the same thing that had been happening with word writing was inevitably going to happen with the oral culture and with the music. And so the other project, and I will finish on this, that I've been working on for the last 15 years, the project, has been listening to the voices, to the music that's being created by or remembered by the immigrants in the peripheries of Rome today, which I think is the real folk music of Rome. Because if we define folk music as the musical expression of the popular classes, or the marginalized, or the exploited people, well, the marginalized and exploited people in Rome are now, to a large extent, people from Bangladesh, from Punjab, from Ukraine, from Libya, from Ethiopia, and so that, and then I realized that what has been happening with music is not unlike what had happened with the Italian immigrants, a reworking of their cultural background to make sense of the new conditions. I remember doing an interview with a lady from Punjab who lives in the extreme southern peripheries of Rome, and she wanted to be a singer, but her family wouldn't let her, so she moved to Rome. She worked as a seamstress. She's now moved on to London because migrants, keep moving, and she sang Bollywood songs, but somehow they acquired a whole different meaning. Songs about nostalgia, for instance. It's one thing if you listen to a song about nostalgia of my little village, nostalgia for my family from the screen of a Bollywood movie, or if you hear a lady who's abandoned, who had to leave her homeland, who had to leave her family, sing about nostalgia. It's just not the same thing. And perhaps my favorite example, uh, I once met uh, this man from the Philippines. His name was Camilo Cosmecio. And he was a good singer. And some people pointed him out to me and said, you ought to record him. He's a great singer. He sings all the time. So we made an appointment and we sat down and he started singing and then he broke down in tears and he couldn't sing. And he couldn't go on. So I said, look, I'm sorry. Let's forget about it. I'm really sorry. He said, no, come back tomorrow morning. I'll think it over. So we met the next day, and actually he started singing. And he sang a song that says, my dear son, you have no idea how much your mother and I thanked heaven when you were born. You have no idea how much we loved you. We love you. You have no idea of how we would give our lives for you. But it's a great song about parents' love for a child. And then I realized, and he says, actually, this is not a folk song. This is a song by Fred Aguilar. Fred Aguilar is a rock and pop star in the Philippines and in the United States, and it's called Anak, which means song in Tagalog. So what I did, I looked up Fred Aguilar on YouTube, and here it is, except that the song had two verses. The first was a verse about parents loving their child that Camilo had sang. The second verse was, and after we gave you all this love, why are you turning against us? What have we done wrong? So actually the song was not so much about parental love as about generational conflict. What had happened? It happened that by forgetting or simply omitting the second verse, Camilo had turned a pop song about generational conflict into a folk song about a migrant parent's nostalgia for his child. He had to leave. He had actually had left the song in the Philippines. He hadn't seen him for 8 years. So, okay, so to come to a close. And first of all, the history of a city which is a symbol of the center of empire, the center of the Catholic Church, the center of the state, or the center of Western culture and everything. The history of this town for the last at least 150 years has been made not in the historic center, where the big buildings somehow freeze history into a monumental representation and turn it into a tourist consumption. But it's been made in the belt of working class neighborhoods all around the city, by the peripheries. With first of all, it was the people that lived in the peripheries that rebuilt the center after the war, and that built the whole new expansion of Rome. It was the people in the peripheries that fought the resistance, and it is the people in the peripheries that are making this history now. Well, I said you were welcome to interrupt and comment. You didn't. So I will stop here and thank you so much for your attention. Thank you.
Hello, am I audible? Okay, okay. Uh, it is thus with particular anticipation that we turn to his lecture today, Periphery and Migration in Rome. Too often, Rome is imagined through its marble monuments and imperial past as the eternal city of emperors, popes, and powers. But Professor Portelli asks us to look beyond the postcard image, toward the ages, the peripheries, the lived geographies, where migrants arrive, work, struggle, and dream. He reveals a Rome that is not only ancient but contemporary, not only monumental but human, a city reshaped daily by those who, though often rendered invisible, sustain its life and redefine its future. In his hands, the stories of migrants are not statistics but voices, not case studies but lived truths. He teaches us that to understand Rome or indeed any city, we must listen to those who clean its streets, build its homes, and carry their memories across oceans and borders. In their narratives lie the real maps of belonging, displacement, and resilience. On behalf of Voices from the Periphery, I extend our deepest gratitude and most heartfelt welcome to Professor Alessandro Portelli. To hear him is to be reminded that story does not only reside in archives or monuments, but in the voices of those who live at the margins. We are privileged to have him with us today, and we know that his words will move us, challenge us, and inspire us to listen more carefully, more ethically, and more courageously to the world's unfolding at the peripheries of power.
Thank
Now,
you.
yeah, sir. Okay, so now I want to move to our question answer session, and I would like to ask you the questions what the listeners asked in our YouTube platform. So, with your permission, may I proceed, sir?
I'm sorry, I missed the last part.
Okay, so can I ask those questions from our YouTube platform with your kind permission? If you,
Of course, yes.
yeah, thank
Please.
you so much. Okay, so the first question is from my friend Ayush. He is also, I mean, one of our voices from the periphery, but unfortunately, he's in Shillong and their network connection is too down. So he is asking that oral history depends on voices, but migration is equally defined by silence, by fear, erasure, and invisibility. Can silence itself be treated as a historical text? And if so, how do we interpret it without imposing meaning or violating its integrity?
Well, basically, um, okay, there was uh, um, an essay by a this anthropologist, his last name was Basso, American, who studied the relationship between speech and silence in Western civilization and in the Native American Apache community. And he says, while we in the West think of silence as the opposite of speech, for the Apache, silence is part of speech. So I think when we, in our oral history work, we we take that position. Silences are a form of communication. What is not spoken, what people cannot will refuse to talk about, is as much of a historical information and what people say, uh, because it there's an important essay, one of the early important essays in oral history by Luisa Passerini, which is exactly about silences. So that if we include silence as part of speech, then it is as significant as anything else. The fact that people will not go into that there are things that cannot be talked about, um, will tell you great things, tells you a lot about them. You know. So I think, yes, we should think of silence as part of speech, as after all, you cannot have silence in writing. You can only have silence in orality. Think about it. A blank page is a space. Silence is a time. So, uh, so silence is an essential part of oral culture.
Okay. So the next question is from Rakhi. She is asking that Rome is conventionally narrated through monuments and empire, but migrant lives inscribe a different geography of labor, precarity, and belonging at the peripheries. How can oral history remap the city so that these margins become central to the story of Rome itself?
Well, basically, this is what I've done all my life. This is one of the this is one of the books that I wrote, and it's about one of the working class neighborhoods. That's exactly what oral history has done, um, because we have uh, recognized that this imperial and touristic image of the city somehow silences the real living history of the city, and makes it um, makes it very difficult for us to perceive Rome as part of contemporary reality, not just a relic of a great past. So, and this is done primarily by oral sources, because this is uh, because most of the documentation about the peripheries is still from the point of view of the institutions, from the point of view of the government, and it's primarily from oral sources that we have the voices of other people who are living in the periphery and creating the city.
Okay, thank you, sir. The next question is from Arnab. He is asking that in recording migrant memories, how can oral historians avoid turning testimony into appropriation, transforming lived struggles into academic artifacts? Where is the line between preservation and possession?
It's a very thin line, and we're always in danger of crossing it. I believe that the first um, consideration is um, to think of what people say in the interview as a creative act in which the interviewee is the author of a story and the owner of those words. So that even if we place the interview in our archive, they remain their property, and we cannot use them without their permission. Uh, so that this this is not this is one of the reasons why, ironically, I do not ask for release forms. because a release form turns the interview into my property. I can do anything with it. By not having a release form, I know that I'm using other people's properties, and therefore I have to get there. I have at least I have to use it in ways that will not cause them inconvenience or problems. Uh, on on the other hand, uh, what we retain, I think, is the duty of taking the so-called testimony to another level, the duty of interpretation, the duty of putting individual narratives in the context of other narratives, of other sources, there, uh, and sometimes, sometimes you run into into the fact that you read in these narratives, in these words, a lot more meaning than the person had been aware of to begin with. And in any case, before you talk about it, you have to get their permission.
Okay, thank you so much. Sir, the next question is from Akash. He is asking that the very term periphery assumes a center, but in a city fractured by ruins, tourism, and migrant labor, does this binary still hold? Does oral history demand a new conceptual vocabulary beyond center and periphery?
Well, number one, you define center and periphery as part of a relationship, not just as essentialist spaces. The periphery exists in tension, dialogue, struggle with the center, and vice versa. The center exists. The center is supported by the periphery, and the center. Um, uh, in fact, most of the um, political discourse today in Italy has to do with the fact that even progressive politics, even the left, has somehow um, abandoned the peripheries, has concentrated more on more abstract issues and ignored much of the living conditions in the periphery. So that what used to be radical left-wing neighborhoods are often turning into a right-wing enclaves because they've been abandoned. So on the one hand, so we think in terms of a relationship. We do not think in terms of identities. And then, of course, we realize that there's that let me put it this way: the neighborhood of Centocelle, which is the one that I worked on in the book I showed you, has been a periphery for generations. It is now being perceived as somehow central by the people living in further peripheries that have developed later. So that while the youth from Centocelle used to get on the subway and come to the center shopping or just walking around, now the kids of Valle Aurelia are getting on the buses and going to Centocelle to shop, so that there are different. There are a number of intermediate spaces. There are also very important processes of gentrification, in which former peripheries are being turned into little Greenwich villages, and gentrified. So it's not. They're not essentialist. They're not separate. It's a continuum, and it's a relationship, and it keeps changing. What used to be the periphery becomes part of the center as the city broadens. Also, transportation changes things. Before Rome had a subway, Centocelle was really somewhere else. On the subway, it takes 5 minutes, well, 15 minutes to get from Centocelle to the capital.
Okay, sir. The next question is from PLE. She is asking that migration is deeply political, entangled in citizenship, exclusion, and xenophobia. Can the oral historian remain simply a listener, or does neutrality itself become an ethical failure in the face of migrant precarity?
Well, yes, definitely. Uh, well, what oral history is about is really conflict, and so that documenting the extents of racism, of prejudice, of sexism, of homophobia is part of what is part of our task, which primarily means that we mainly listen to the victims. We mainly listen to the people who have been discriminated, to the people who are being, but also we listen to the people who are struggling against these this this relationship. We listen to the people who are organizing the communities against racism. Listen to the and the musicians, for instance, musicians and the writers are very much a part of this struggle for recognition of our shared human nature. So, so yes, I think basically, you know, one of, one of the things that oral history needs to do, that all intellectual work needs to do, is, as the phrase says, speak truth to power, but not just to power, not just tell the ruling classes how things, but also to the powerless that often had a wrong image of themselves, you know, and so that generating a self-critical awareness of identity in among the working class, among migrant communities, which is often perceived as you know. Sometimes people imagine that that you're there to create a positive story of them. No, we're out to create a critical narrative of all identities, so that primarily, you know, politically, the most important thing for oral history work is its independence, its and its openness, flexibility, being ready to accept stories that you would like not to hear, but who need a listening.
Okay, it's the last question. Okay, so it's from Shubhadeep. He's asking, oral history of migration inevitably enters the realm of politics, citizenship debates, rights, integration, xenophobia. To what extent can the oral historian remain a listener rather than an activist? Or is neutrality itself an ethical failure in the face of migrant precarity?
Well, number one, um, I think, you know, just the fact that somebody's listening to you, that somebody's asking you to tell your story is a form of receiving respect, especially if, and this is very important, when you do an oral history interview, you may be, the most important professor in the world, and the person you're interviewing may be a illiterate peasant. But if you do the interview, it's because the illiterate peasant knows things that you professor don't know. In other words, the primary attitude in the work of oral history is humility and respect. And when you talk to people who are being disrespected and you offer respect, when you talk to people who are not being, who they're not voiceless, they have voices, but nobody is listening to them. When you talk to these people and listen to their voice, then you're already somehow encouraging them to recognize their role, their presence in history and politics. So this is one thing. I truly believe that just doing the interviews, just doing the work, if it's done with humility and respect, is a form of political intervention, of political change. And then, of course, then we do have some power as intellectuals, which means that we have access to media, we have access to communication, we have access, and therefore we can bring those voices out of their immediate, of their neighborhood, of their village, and make them part of national, even international discourse. So this means that this is a form of empowerment. This is I think there are much more important things that must be done for working poor people to get their rights. But ours is a small contribution, well, not so small maybe, in terms of self-awareness and recognition of one's active and significant presence in history. You're going to want somebody to say, look, I know you have things to say. I'm going to learn from you, and I'm interested in the things you say. That's already giving respect, paying respect. I think respect is a key word here.
Okay, thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.
Before we bring today's gathering to a close, I wish to extend on behalf of Voices from the Periphery and everyone present here our profound gratitude to you, Professor Portelli. Your presence with us today has been nothing short of a privilege. Through your lecture, you have guided us into the layered realities of periphery and migration in Rome, a Rome far removed from marble monuments and grand narratives, a Rome alive with the voices those who arrive at its edges, who labor, who endure, and who reimagine what belonging means. You reminded us that the periphery is not outside history but at its very heart, and that to hear migrants is to hear the city itself speaking in new, urgent, and transformative ways. What you offered us was not merely an analysis but a way of listening. You showed us that the stories of migrants are not fragments to be collected but truth to be honored. That memory, when voiced at the margins, carries both the burden of displacement and the hope of renewal. You have reminded us that oral history is not only a method, it is an ethic, a practice of humility, respect, and deep attention. The generosity of your words leaves us with much to reflect upon. The necessity of listening where society refuses to listen, the danger of reducing voices to data, and the ethical imperative to hear stories as acts of dignity rather than as objects of study. These lessons extends beyond the classroom and the archive. They touch the very core of how we imagine community justice and humanity itself. We live today not only intellectually enriched but also morally awakened to listen more carefully, to attend more ethically, and to carry forward the voices of those at the periphery with the reverence they deserve. From the depths of our hearts, we thank you, Professor Portelli, for reminding us that history is not only what is written, but also what is sung, spoken, remembered, and lived. Though this season now comes to a close, the dialogue you have opened will continue in our scholarship, in our solidaritaries, and in the collective imagination of a world more attentive to its margins. With that, we humbly bring this gathering to a close, carrying forward the inspiration and the responsibility that your words have placed upon us. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you, and stay in touch and come see me around. Okay?
Yeah, yeah, thank you so much, sir. Sure.
Thank you.
Okay,
Bye.
sir. Bye.